you look at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, there's some rather interesting information about the official territory of the country. The website says that the territory of Japan comprises the 4 large islands of Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, and other smaller islands. Well, of course, the ministry isn't lying to you, but the phrase other smaller islands is perhaps quickly ignored. And this is why it's so important to talk about the forgotten islands of the land of the rising sun, which actually appear on any poorly drawn atlas and even Google Maps. Before we start, give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. So first, let's take a step back and work with what we know. Today, the Japan we know is a hub of democracy with a ceremonial emperor. In the rapid technological progress of Asia, Japan is at the forefront of many industries, including electronics, robotics, and information technology. However, the modern tendencies of the country were only established after the Second World War, when Japan lost the last of its colonies, including Taiwan. If we have to put a timeline on what happened after 1945, we can see that the country lost almost all of its territory that was acquired after 1894. The Allied powers, particularly the United States of America, began the occupation and rehabilitation of Japan. In the last big battle of the war, the US acquired the Okinawa Islands, which today make up Japan's 5 big territorial islands. While the US had its eyes on Okinawa, the beginning of the Soviet-Japanese War also led to a major territorial loss for the country. The Soviet Union had occupied the Kuril Islands off the northern coast of Japan's Hokkaido Islands. Eventually, in 1972, Okinawa was returned to Japan. However, the Kuril Islands were inherited by Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. To date, Japan and Russia have a territorial dispute over Kunashiri, Edarofu, Shikotan, and the Habomai, the 4 islands in the Kuril chain. Today, mainland Japan is much smaller than what it was during its imperialist period. Between the Meiji Restoration of 1868 and the mid-20th century, Japan's territorial control rivaled big European colonizers and superpowers. Believe it or not, the Japanese imperial empire stretched from Alaska to Singapore. So whenever you get fascinated or tired by how densely populated Tokyo is, just know that there was a time when the population was thinly spread. Today, not so much. If you're visiting Japan, chances are you'll make the first pit stop at the island of Honshu, which is the largest and most populated island in the Japanese archipelago and the 7th largest island in the world. Honshu is home to Japan's historical capital, Kyoto, and its modern technological capital, Tokyo. The island has active volcanoes, the mighty Japanese Alps, as well as the country's biggest river, Shinano, flowing through its terrain. Then, of course, there's the controversial Hokkaido Island, which stands on the dark history of Japanese imperialism. Prior to Japan's aggressive settlement in the region, the island was called Izo and was inhabited by the Ainu people. Yet in 1869, the Yamato ethnic group began to dispose of Ainu off their lands and began a massive assimilation project in the province. There's a lot of speculation about why the Japanese began to imperialize the Izo province. However, many sources cite the colonial project as more of a strategic maneuver, as the empire was desperate to guard its northern borders from Russian invasion. Centuries later, the fertile land of the island is very important for modern-day Japan's food supply, as well as its booming tourism industry. The 3rd largest of the 4 main islands in Japan is Kyushu, which houses the country's most active volcano, Mount Aso. Out of the country's main islands, Kyushu is closest to continental Asia. This is why the island has been historically and politically important for the country's trade ties with China and the Korean Peninsula. The last of Japan's main islands is Shikoku, which shockingly has a distinct feature of its own. You see, it's the only large area in the country that has no active volcanic activity. The island is largely known for being the Mecca of Buddhist pilgrimage. Stories and myths originating from the province tell a story of the gods creating beautiful Japan, where Shikoku was created second. So there's no doubt that the island is very important to the country. But perhaps we can't say the same for the island known as Okinawa, which is most ineligible to make it to Japan's main islands due to its relatively smaller size. Regardless, some geographers still include it in the country's main chain of islands. The island was annexed by Japan in 1879, largely at the expense of the indigenous Ryukyuan people, who still struggle for their political rights today. It's not a shocker that the US has 32 military facilities on the island, which the indigenous populations regularly protest against. Not too much avail though. At last, we come to Japan's forgotten islands that do not meet the mainland criteria for the country. The Nanpo Islands of the country start just off Honshu's Izu Peninsula near Tokyo, and their territory expands 1,200 kilometers to the south. This less-known archipelago's most notable feature is the 9 Izu Islands, which are currently inhabited. Izu-Oshim, Toshim, Niijima, Kozushim, Miyakijima, Mikurajima, Hachijojima, Shikinejima, and Aogashima Islands have little to no human populations. Currently, these islands fall into the Tokyo metropolis jurisdiction, given their close proximity to the capital city. But of course, the furthest islands are not close enough to mainland Japan. The history of the islands is a bit controversial too. A lot of Japanese sources claim to have discovered the lands, while other historians only link their connection to the country through annexation plans. Being under Tokyo metropolis might change a thing or two for the Nanpo Islands, particularly in regard to development plans. Even then, the furthest islands of the archipelago, the Okino Torishima Island and the Minami Torishima Island, expand Japan's exclusive economic zone in the Pacific Ocean. In several ways, these islands reaffirm Japanese territoriality in the deep blue waters of the Pacific. So yeah, they are not technically useless as one might deem. Not to mention the region has some historicity too. While certain archaeologists have discovered traces of unknown Micronesian civilization in the area, the island has some recent political traits too. By recent, we mean the 1600s and 1700s, when Hachijojima was rendered as a place for political exile. Speaking of historical aspects, the Ogasawara or Bonin Islands of the Nanpo Archipelago have an imperial past too. And while that tells us something about how British, North American, and Japanese colonial ventures were mapping out areas that are mostly inaccessible today. For instance, you can get to the Bonin Islands for sure, but it would take you more than 20 hours on a ferry ride from Tokyo. Even then, away from the mainland, imperial powers did establish colonies in this region, particularly in Chichijima. It was 1875 when Japan fully annexed the island and later established a military base there. A few years later, the native non-Japanese populations were granted citizenship status too. And no, that's not the extent of how forgotten Japanese history is. If you travel southwest of the country, you'll hopefully encounter another series of abandoned and forgotten islands, the Nansei Islands, which house the famous Okinawa region. This area is broadly known as the Ryukyu Archipelago, and while its most notable feature is the Okinawa Island, there are other conjectures that aren't as inhabited. The chain of islands covers an extensive geographical area. The islands stretch southwest from the southern region of Kyushu and end at Yonaguni Island, which is pretty close to another disputed place known as Taiwan. The chain of islands that begins with the southern tip of Kyushu consists of the Satsusan Islands, which consists of Osumi, Tokara, and Amami Island groups. Deeper into the chain, you'll find the series of Okinawa and Sakishima Islands. The latter, due to their remoteness, remain largely forgotten and abandoned.